In the 1980s, Hans Eysenck and his colleagues really published some interesting papers and did some fascinating research on stress reaction styles. And they identified 4 basic stress reaction styles. So, of course, people run into a lot of stressful things in life. And what we find is it's not that some people experience less stress than others. In other words, experience less stressful situations, but that we all tend to react differently, react differently to stress. And these are the 4 styles that Eysenck and his colleagues identified. Some people have a tendency to give up. Okay, so when they're experiencing something really stressful, they react with hopelessness and they have the tendency to give up and to be rather depressed about it. Sometimes people act with anger. Okay, they tend to get very angry, sometimes even aggressive and hostile because of the stress that they're experiencing in life. Now, some people react by researching options. Okay, so how many of you out there, like me, tend to Google your way out of it? In other words, you run into a big problem and you try to find the solution by doing all this research on Google. We know who we are, right? We know we tend to do that. That is the 3rd style. And then there's the 4th style, which is a mixture of 2 or more of the other 3. Okay? So some people react by kind of switching between 2 of them or all 3 of them, okay, in their styles, in their reactions to stress. Okay. Then, Eysenck and his colleagues went on to do research, some really interesting research in this regard, finding out some pretty significant things. Like, for instance, can you guess who it is? People with which style tend to be significantly more likely than the others, okay, people with other styles, to die from cardiovascular problems. Now, just recently we talked about type A personality, so I think you probably figured this out, right? And if you thought the 2nd style here, anger, aggression, then you are correct, okay? Next question, who do you guess, which people who have which reaction style are significantly more likely to die from cancer? And if you guessed hopelessness, you are correct, okay? Now, if you looked at, people who are the least likely, okay, what would be your guess here? Which are the least likely to die from things like cardiovascular problems or cancer? And you might have guessed researching options, and that is related, but it is not the correct answer. The correct answer is actually this last one, mixture of the above, but only if the mixture includes researching options, which is really interesting in and of itself. What it means here is that even if you sometimes react with hopelessness and or anger, okay, as long as you also have that tendency to try to do research and try to find a solution, then you suffer from you benefit from this researching option. So even if it's mixed with the others, you benefit from it. Now, sometimes when people look at this research, they tend to blame the victim and think if people die from cardiovascular problems or cancer, that it is their fault for not doing research, for instance. Well, that's silly. Sometimes researching options can help and often does, and that's probably why we see this here. For instance, if someone finds out from their doctor that, they have a blocked artery, for instance, they may do research and find ways to reduce that risk in the future, maybe get the surgery, bypass surgery, um, and do something that helps, but sometimes there's absolutely nothing you can do, right? And the same is true with cancer. And so keep that in mind. Okay. Very interesting research. There's also very interesting research from the trade approach, and we look at lifetime shifts in the Big Five. So very early on in this class, I talked about the idea that over your lifetime, there's some movement in the Big Five, there's some shifts. But remember that, this idea that personality is durable over time, meaning that if you are high on something, you're always going to be high compared to your peers. So one of the things to remember here is we're still, you can move within your range, but your parentheses, you might think, on this continuum in either direction, and it can make a difference in your lifestyle or your happiness, satisfaction in life, but you're still going to be high or low or medium high compared to your peers. So let's look at these shifts. As you grow older, okay, you tend to become more conscientious. That tends to be a good thing. Usually. And as you grow older, you tend to become more agreeable, which is also a good thing. Okay? Neuroticism tends to reduce. For instance, older people tend to care less what other people think about them. And that is usually a good thing. Extroversion tends to also go down. Okay? And remember that being more introverted doesn't mean being more shy, right? It means preferring your own thoughts, reading, that solitary kind of activity, or writing, or thinking your own thoughts, to being around other people. And that extroversion goes down, so as you age, you tend to become more introverted. And finally, you become less open. So sometimes you might have heard about older people becoming more set in their ways. That does seem to happen where you become more set in your ways. But keep in mind, too, that if you are high in openness right now, you're still going to be high in openness compared to your peers, your peer group then. And then some really interesting research on changing personality. So again, you could think of personality as durable, and you could think of it on a dimension. And you could think wherever you score on something, have kind of parentheses around your score with effort and motivation. You can move up or down within those parentheses. Okay? And so one really interesting study that came out of the trade approach is looking at drug rehab. People who have successfully gone through these programs of drug rehabilitation. And we say successfully, so if they've come out of the program and it has helped them to overcome their addiction, okay, researchers have looked at their scores before going into the program on the Big Five, and then again, believe it or not, 15 months, so over a year after coming out of the program successfully. And they found that, one, these programs tend to decrease your neuroticism scores and to increase agreeableness and conscientiousness scores. Again, very interesting. And then finally, they've also done some research on changing personality from on this idea of social anxiety. or shyness. So remember that shyness comes from this anxiety in social situations of being evaluated more negatively. Okay, so if this bothers people, they know they're shy. Keep in mind that about 40% of Americans self-identify as shy. And if this really bothers them and they really want to do something about it, with motivation and a lot of courage, you can do something about it. In other words, you have to actually put yourself in these situations where you think, no, I would just die. I would rather not go to that party. Or, I would rather not stand in front of class and give a presentation or something like that. You have to actually purposely put yourself in these situations. Okay? It takes a lot of motivation, a lot of courage, but the idea here is you think you're going to die, and then you find out that even if the worst happens, you don't die, all right? Hey. Speaking of social anxiety, now I want you to get out questionnaire number 4, or I'm sorry, your self-assessment sheet. Look at your score for questionnaire number 4. We're going to interpret that now. First off, the range of possible responses or scores here is from 0 to 80. From 0 to 80. Lowest possible score, 0. Highest, 80. Okay. And the mean for ASU students who have taken this class before is 33. 33. So this way you can see if you're above the mean, below the mean, or pretty much around that mean.